Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Chairman, and I have to confess to not having been on the Select Committee, but I think anyone who picks up this bill, it's quite a substantive one, has to have an interest. The electricity industry bill, this industry, and of course the electricity itself, affects each and every New Zealander, whether they be an industry or they be a pensioner or they be someone who just wants the comfort of a nice underfloor heating in their batch by the sea. Whatever, Mr Speaker, it is really important we get this right. And we're going to part 2 here, and I go through, and it lists in Clause 9 industry participants. And back in the good old days, you might say, or the days that people understand, where we had increases in electricity costs, there was no doubt about that, but there was security of supply and we had an integrated system. There was basically ECNZ, and you had a local lines company, and you dealt with that. People knew kind of what they paid, and some of them had to guarantee the price because they'd had a line extended to their place. And we've now moved into this new era of user pays and the market, etc., etc. And if you read through the participants, people will start to get worried. For example, industry service providers are industry participants, and these are the layers of people who will be in this new electricity system, this wonderful new market that the National Party is trying to create here. A market operations service provider, a metering equipment provider, a metering equipment owner, an ancillary service agent, a person that operates an approved test house, a load aggregator, a trader in electricity, Mr Speaker. They go on, and I guess all of these people will take a little slice in terms of costs or in profit, and ultimately the consumer will pay. And so the more complex we make a system, and this is exactly what is going on here, the more costly that will be. There is, of course, a code, an industry code, and Clause 11 says here, industry participants to register and comply with the code. And I guess if it's in building, we understand the need for that, given that the national government's attempts to deregulate back in the early 90s, of course, again, led to leaky homes in this country because they didn't have an adequate code. They thought that the market would deliver, and it failed. Well, I say to them, this is another classic example of tinkering around with a failed model. Mr Speaker, you have to register and you must comply with the code. Unless, Mr Speaker, because Clause 12 said exemption from obligation to register. And one of them here in 12A 1AB is that the authority may grant an individual exemption to an industry participant only if the authority is satisfied that, one of them, exempting the participant will reduce overall administration and compliance costs. Well, what a bizarre statement, Mr Chairman. And I hope that the Minister and the Chair can answer that, because exempting anyone from any code would do that, reduce compliance costs. And so the question is, if that is what a qualification for a person to seek exemption, then is everyone going to be exempt? Because most of them could probably say, or the authority would have its costs reduced, which is, I think, what the intent is here. But I would have thought that we had a user pays regime here, that if we had a code and people were obliged to commit to it, then they would be keeping the costs on that. And in that way, making sure the costs are kept low. Mr Speaker, I just think this is a complex piece of legislation. It's a band-aid to try and patch up a failed structure in electricity in this country. And most New Zealanders understand that. It doesn't matter where you go, doesn't matter who you speak to, most understand that the electricity structure in this country needs major reform. We've acknowledged that. We have to make some major changes, and tinkering, as Minister Brownlee has done here, in my view, will just lead to a more complex, a more costly, and a more ineffective way of governing supply, generation, efficiency the one goal that we should all be focused on, and that is making better use of the energy and electricity in this country, Mr. Speaker. I don't think this bill is going to help in that direction at all, and it'd be great to hear an explanation.
Aaron Gilmore.